So, we are starting our class with the topic of Reconstruction. And this 12-year period is fundamental in understanding how the next century of American history will unfold. During these 12 years, we are looking at issues regarding race, issues regarding class, issues regarding all sorts of economic struggle, political struggle. And while they are addressed in some ways, because they are unresolved in most ways, it's going to play a significant role in how things unfold well into the 19th and 20th century. And so it's important that you pay attention to what happens during this 12 years. Because a lot of what we talk about here in Reconstruction, we are going to repeat over the course of the next several weeks as we talk about U.S. history as it unfolds. So when we talk about Reconstruction, the very word Reconstruction means to rebuild, right? So there's a lot of intentionality behind that word. We're rebuilding after the war. But I want to make it clear that when we talk about the impact of this war, we are talking about something that is extensive and devastating in a lot of different ways. And we have to begin by talking about intention behind the war, right? So a lot of times when people talk about the Civil War, there is this tendency to lean towards heroics and talk about the United States, or in this term, the Union, and the cause with which or for which the United States was fighting for. But when we talk about the United States in the context of the Civil War, the Union is not fighting to end slavery, as many people want to argue, as many people want to believe. The Union, and even Abraham Lincoln, especially Abraham Lincoln, is fighting for the cause of preserving the Union. Preserving the Union meaning they want to keep the United States intact, keeping the South from seceding, making sure that all of these states stay together and establish the unity of the United States. That's what's most important to Abraham Lincoln. That is his first priority. In fact, in December of 1860, he gives a speech in which he says the following: secession would destroy the only democracy in existence and prove for all time to both future Americans and the world that a government of the people could not survive. In other words, what he's talking about is, if you secede, Southerners, if you leave this country, what you're essentially saying is that democracy cannot and does not work. And so for him, the cause is to keep the country united to prove a greater point, and that is the point of democracy, that democracy can succeed, that it can be sustained, and it can thrive. Nowhere in there does he talk about the preservation of slavery. In fact, Lincoln promises that he will do whatever he can to preserve the institution of slavery as it was. He does say, he says, I won't allow slavery to expand or extend into the American West, but slavery where it is still allowed. In fact, he says if enslaved people run away and try to escape to the north, then the northern states are obligated to return those enslaved people to the South, back to their plantations where they escaped from. So he does whatever he can do to try to appease southern states and try to keep them in the country, right? But despite all of those promises, southern states are not convinced, right? In fact, as soon as Abraham Lincoln is elected as president, so he's elected in November of 1860, pretty soon after, South Carolina secedes, and then 11 more states secede by February of 1861. And so when we talk about the Confederacy and why they are fighting, why they leave the Union and why they will fight the war, it is pretty clear that they are fighting for the preservation of slavery. So a lot of times, especially in the last several decades, we have heard the argument that Southerners, that Confederate soldiers were fighting for states' rights, that they were fighting for a cultural identity. But what I want you to understand is the state's right that they want to preserve is the right to own other people, right? They want to preserve this cultural identity that is based on the labor, the free labor of enslaved peoples. Slavery is the backbone of the Southern economy. And it had been for at that point a couple of centuries. And so this issue, this institution is not only about race, it is economical, it is cultural. And so the racism is deeply embedded into their economics, politics, and social relations. And so when people try to argue against that, what historians do is we point to the primary sources. And in this case, the primary sources that strengthen this argument is what the states actually say in their secession statements. So each state, to announce that they have seceded from the Union, each state would present this kind of secession statement. So what you're looking at here is the secession statement from Georgia, or as they called themselves in that time, the Republic of Georgia. And this is passed in January of 1861, as you can see at the top there, January of 1861. And it is essentially a statement that would then be signed by all of their delegates in their legislature. So this is their official declaration, but later on, in later pages, they give a much longer statement and explaining why they are leaving. And in the later statement, or in the following pages, they include this statement: the people of Georgia, having dissolved their political connection with the government of the United States of America, present to their Confederates, meaning their fellow countrymen, and the world, the causes which have led to the separation. For the last 10 years, in other words, since 1850, which is when the Republican Party was established, for the last 10 years, we have had numerous and serious causes of complaint against our non-slave holding Confederate states with reference to the subject of African slavery. So they are talking about the fundamental difference between slaveholding states and non-slaveholding states. And the fact that what they argue is that those people who are non-slaveholders, those states that are non-slaveholding, they don't understand us. They don't understand why we want to hold on to the institution of slavery, so much so that they are willing to go to war over this. So while they go to war, one of the things that I want you to understand is the impact of this war, right? Because war is not an easy thing to go through, right? War is always traumatic. War is always costly, right? We're not just talking about the financial expense. We're talking about the emotional and psychological expense. But it's far worse when it is a civil war, because you are fighting against your own countrymen. And it is a threat to the existence of your very country, right? It is threatening the very fabric of your country. So a civil war is very different. And what happens in the end is you have 625,000 people who are dead as a result of this war. It is bloody. It is the deadliest war in the history of the United States, in that this is the war that we have lost the most Americans. It does something to the American morale. But on the other side of it, we have the elimination of slavery. Slavery no longer exists in the United States thanks to the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery officially as an institution. And we now have these contentions, these arguments, and these debates about what life is going to be like for now freed peoples. What do they do? How do we help, if we help at all? What does it mean for them to be free, right? How do we help them transition into a free and equal society, if that's what this is going to end up being, right? Now, for Abraham Lincoln, just before the war comes to its end, Abraham Lincoln is reelected to a second term, and he makes the argument in his second inaugural address. He says, he uses the quote, "with malice towards none," meaning we're not going to hold any grudges. We want to forgive each other and we want to move on. He believes that a quick reunification process is key to healing the country. So he's not really focused on the idea of freedom and helping these 4 million people transition into a life of freedom. He's focused on reunification, and that's important for you to remember. So Lincoln's intentions is not to help 4 million people transition from enslaved to free. His focus is, how do we reunify? Now, for freed people, it's very different. And I'm going to spend a few minutes here because talking about this whole idea of freedom means so much more to Black Americans. Of course, I'm referring to them as Americans in this context, not because they are seen as American citizens here, and nor are they legally American citizens, but it's just easy. It's easier to clarify who we're talking about here. So for Black Americans, freedom is defined in three different ways. The first way that we're going to talk about is on a social level, okay? Socially, when we talk about freedom, one of the first things that they do is they establish a legal standing for their own families. And what that means is they are now allowed to legally marry their spouses. Before, if an enslaved person were to marry someone else on their plantation, they could have a ceremony, but that ceremony had no legal standing. It was not recognized by the state. It was not given any kind of documentation or a marriage certificate. So that allowed for the plantation owner to sell one or more of their slaves without any kind of regard to marital status or family relations, right? Which is why you have a lot of instability among Black families in this time period or throughout this time period of slavery. It's because children are sold, families are broken up. So one of the first things that they do is they establish families. A family is supposed to serve as a nucleus, a foundation, right? It serves as a basis for your identity. Having a mom, a dad, siblings, this is your go-to. This is who you go to at the end of the day. These are the people who you have dinner with. These are the people that you have everyday communications with. That sense of stability is key to their development. That's normal for every human being. And that had been denied to them for generations, right? For a few hundred years. And so to establish that finally, legally, is incredibly important to them. Here's the other social aspect. Another social aspect that they establish their freedom, and that is by establishing their own churches. And churches are going to be central to Black communities, especially in the South, because churches serve as more than just a place of worship. But churches will serve as essentially a hub, a community hub where people will meet to have social events. They will meet to have political gatherings. They can have political discussions in a church. Churches also housed schools, so children could go to school in a church. Churches were incredibly important because churches were safe. And you can go to a church and have community gatherings and feel safe in a church. So it wasn't just about worship. It was about creating a sense of community and togetherness, right? So you can see by establishing their families, by creating a sense of community, the idea is establishing a stronger, greater sense of identity, right? And stability within that identity. Now, here's the other reason why the church is going to be really important. Black ministers are going to be pivotal in helping to establish that stability, right? And Black ministers are quickly seen as leaders in their community, which is why decades later, when the civil rights movement begins in the 1940s and the 1950s, civil rights leaders are going to be ministers as well. Martin Luther King Jr. was a pastor, had just been hired as the pastor of the Baptist Church in Mississippi. And in Montgomery, not Mississippi, Montgomery, Alabama, when the Montgomery bus boycott began, and that's when he became a civil rights leader. So when we talk about these civil rights movements, they are led by ministers, and that's because ministers were trusted leaders in their community. A third way that Black Americans sought social freedom is through education. Education was and is key. Now, when I talk about education, I need you to get your mind out of the idea of obtaining a degree, because while obtaining a degree is important and is a part of the process, that's not the end goal. The goal is enlightenment. The goal is knowledge, right? The goal is to learn, which is what I hope you're doing, right? The idea is you want to be able to learn as much as you can, because regardless of how society feels about you, despite your race, your gender, your income status, all of that, they cannot take away what you know. They cannot take away your knowledge. And what is really important to that is knowledge is power. And knowledge is freedom. And when we talk about gaining knowledge, a key step to that is literacy, being able to read, which is why enslaved people were denied the right to learn how to read. Reading led to freedom. Reading led to understanding. Reading led to knowledge. That's the same power of schools and education. Education means freedom. Education means knowledge. And that's what we're talking about. So it's not just about the degree, because the degree is helpful. The degree has economic benefits, certainly, but it's also about knowing who you are and having the knowledge of a larger society and world around you. So the second way they see freedom is, of course, politically. And when we talk about politically, what we're talking about is in a different way, in two different ways. The first step, or the first way, is through citizenship. Keep in mind that from the very beginning of this country, from the time that they write, the earliest form of the Constitution, which is the Articles of Confederation, to the actual Constitution, Black Southerners were not defined as citizens. They were defined as property. And in determining how many people would be in the House of Representatives to represent the South, they would count, each individual Black Southerner would count as 3/5 of a person. So in most cases, they were property, not people. So to transition from that legal status of property to then transition to person, of course, the expectation is, I want to be a citizen. And citizenship is important because to be a citizen means that you have an identity within the nation where you live. And for all of these people, all 4 million of these people who were born here, raised here, who had been here for generations, having that identity was key. Because now they could say with all certainty that they were a citizen. But of course, that had to be done legally, right? That had to be established by a law. And they wanted citizenship and all the rights therein. That leads me to the second political freedom, and that is voting rights. So, Frederick Douglass, who, of course, is one of the most famous early civil rights leaders, an outspoken abolitionist, Frederick Douglass makes this statement soon after the Civil War is over. He says, in fact, this is later in the 1870s or 1880s, he says, slavery is not abolished until the black man has the ballot. And the reason why he says this is because citizenship is not enough. Citizenship in a democracy doesn't mean anything unless you have the right to vote and until you actually use the right to vote. Because in a democracy, the expectation is that as a citizen, you have a voice and you exercise that voice, that you contribute to the political climate and you contribute to the conversation. Now, whether or not you win every time is not the point, right? You're not going to win on every issue. You're not going to win every election. However, you have the right and you exercise the right to be a part of the conversation. That's the point, right? You want to be a part of the process. And that's what Douglass is arguing, that we don't just want citizenship. We want full citizenship. We want citizenship and voting rights. And that's the key, okay? Now, the third freedom is economics. It's an economic issue. And this right here, this economic freedom is going to come up all throughout this course. This is going to come up now, but it's also going to come up later on when we talk about economic freedom in the 1980s. So what I want you to write down as you're taking notes is put a little asterisk by this or something to give yourself a note that this issue is going to evolve. This thing is going to develop and change depending on who's talking about it and the time period in which we're talking about it. So when enslaved people, for the most part, when we're talking about enslaved people and their labor, a lot of their labor is going to be centered around the land, right? Working outside, developing the land, farming the land, that sort of thing. So when we talk about economic freedom for freed people, what they argue is that the key to their economic freedom will be land ownership. They want property. They want to be able to own their own land, farm their own land, and reap the profits of having their own land, right? To them, property ownership is the key to economic freedom. And understandably so, that's going to be a consistent argument even to this day in the year of our Lord. One of the things that people consistently argue is that you need to buy your own house, buy your own property. You know, how, but if you buy your own property, that's when you are really making some money for yourself. They make the same argument that if we have our own land, we will have access to real and a real economic opportunity. So looking at all three of these ways and the different ways within, for Black Americans, they have these ideas of what freedom means for them. But I want you to understand that when we talk about these different ways of achieving freedom, it is universal. It means that all of us can relate to them, all of us can understand them, and all of us can benefit from them. But here's the problem, okay? When we talk about Black Americans who are making this argument for freedoms that they believe they should have, or they believe that they have earned, or whatever, there are, of course, these obstacles that stand in their way. And one of them, of course, is the system that still remains in the United States regardless of the war. Because remember, the United States, or the Union, or the North, whatever you want to call it, the North isn't fighting for the abolition of slavery. The North is fighting for the cause of preserving the Union. So when we talk about fighting for freedom at these different levels, you have to understand that racism is everywhere. And so you have to really be able to convince an entire population of an entire nation, that your freedom is to the benefit of an entire country, right? Your freedom is for the good of an entire country. And a part of the issue here is that there are a lot of wealthy people and people in power who don't see that. What's particularly important and interesting here is how Southern whites respond to these ideas, right? Southern whites in particular are going to struggle with this because when we talk about the Southern white population, especially just before and during the war, there is this general impression that most Southern white people are plantation owners. And so I want to stop that assumption immediately. Most Southern white people are either very poor or they are small landowners, right? They are, when I say small landowners, I mean farmers who have a few acres of land, and those acres of land are farmed by the family. So it's mom, dad, kids, and maybe some extended members of the family, but they are the ones who farm the land. They're the ones who have to work the land, sell whatever they produce. That's it. And a huge percentage of the people in the South who are white are really, really poor. Many of them will end up working side by side with enslaved people, especially during harvest times, during planting season. It's a struggle for them. And many of them live in abject poverty. Okay, this is what I want you to understand about the distribution of wealth here in the South. The plantation society in the South is the minority. They are roughly 10%, if even that, of Southern society, 10 to 15%, I would say. 10 to 15% of Southern society could be classified as the plantation owners population, but they owned the most amount of land, hundreds and hundreds of acres each. And because they owned that much land, that means they held that much wealth. And because they held that much wealth, they could afford to purchase enslaved people. They could afford to have hundreds of enslaved people working for them and working for them for free, right? And because of all of the wealth they had, that wealth gave them access to power. This is key. This is everything. Wealth means power. And when I say power, what I mean is they have actual access to political power. They have access to the governor, to the state legislature. They also can buy their way into influencing Congress, their congressmen, and their senators. They have access to power, and they have power itself. So having that wealth is incredibly important. And in the meantime, if you are a small-time landowner or if you are a poor Southern white, slavery has ruined things for you. Let me explain. Small landowners are in trouble because they are competing not only against each other, they are competing primarily against plantation owners. And the problem is they can't compete. They cannot compete. Plantation owners are going to produce significantly more. They're going to make much more profit. And of course, they're going to produce much more because they have hundreds of free laborers. On a small farm, it's just you, your spouse, and your kids, right? That's it. Maybe you might have one enslaved person working for you. Maybe, but that's it. And if you are a poor white Southerner, you are totally screwed over by the institution of slavery, because slavery eliminates any kind of job competition for you. If a plantation owner has hundreds of enslaved people working for him, why would he hire you and pay you a wage? There's no way. So trying to find work, regular work, I should say, trying to find regular work for a living wage is impossible, which is why poor Southern whites are stuck in a cycle of poverty in the South. So slavery is actually detrimental to small landowners and to poor Southern whites. However, when we talk about plantation owners and how they are able to push this cause of slavery and make this argument that slavery is worth keeping in the South, despite its harm to a vast majority of Southern whites, here's what you need to understand. Plantation owners successfully convince small landowners and poor Southern whites, hey, listen, we know that economically this is not to your benefit. However, socially and culturally, you are still superior to these Black people. And it's important that we establish a clear power structure. And that power structure is established and solidified by the institution of slavery. So while you and I are not the same economically, we are the same racially, and that's more important. That's how you get thousands of poor white Southern men fighting for the cause of slavery. Not because it's to their economic benefit, but because the social cause of it is presented as that much more important, right? Now, when we talk about this issue of slavery, one of the things that I want you to remember, and I want to make sure that you write this down as well, in addition to the other stuff, is when we talk about holding on to that power, it is through slavery, right? So the idea of owning slaves is not just to their economic benefit. So, for example, when I ask students, why did plantation owners insist on keeping enslaved people? The typical answer I get back is, oh, because that's how they made money and because they didn't want to do the work. That's not right. Okay. Yes, that's part of how they made money. And also it's a part of free labor. Yes, that's true. But slavery helps them hold on to power. Slavery establishes that plantation owners are at the top of the social, economic, and political ladder in the South. So slavery is not just about, these racial implications. It's also about within Southern white society establishing plantation owners at the very top. Okay, so it's a little bit more involved than most people think. Now, with all that said, now that the war is over, or as the war was coming to its end, the question becomes, okay, how are we going to go about actually achieving this free and equal society? One of the things that I want to present to you is this, a little bit of context here. In the federal government, you have two factions of the Republican Party. You have mainstream Republicans who are sort of middle of the road. These are guys who are willing to compromise. They want to see change in the South after the war, but they're not going to be hardcore extremists about it. The other side of the Republican Party are known as radical Republicans. And radical Republicans are going to be much more extreme. They are angry about the war. They are angry about Lincoln's assassination, which takes place in April of 1865. They hate the new president. His name is Andrew Johnson. We'll talk more about him in a minute. They believe in a really aggressive form of Reconstruction. They want to push for a very legislative and very extensive plan of changing the entire governmental structure of the South into something that they like and they approve of. Okay, so it is very different from mainstream Republicans. And the majority of the party are mainstream Republicans, but radical Republicans are the loudest. So mainstream Republicans are the majority, but radical Republicans are the loud ones. The first thing, or one of the first big Reconstruction ideas that come out from Congress that have the support of both mainstream and radical Republicans, is something called the Freedmen's Bureau. So, just so you understand what the Freedmen's Bureau is, the Freedmen's Bureau is a government agency that was designed to carry out this experiment in social policy. The idea was this agency would help freed people transition into mainstream American society. It was a government agency designed to help freed people transition into mainstream society. Because again, you are talking about 4 million people who, for centuries, for generations, had lived as enslaved people and are now being sort of thrown into things and said, okay, you're free, figure it out. And what Republicans are going to argue is that's not going to work. They need help. How do we help them? How do we make sure that they have the support that they need, that if they have questions, we can point them in the right direction, that sort of thing. Now, when we talk about the expectations for the Freedmen's Bureau, the expectations are a lot. There is a lot of pressure on the Freedmen's Bureau. For example, there are expectations that the Freedmen's Bureau establish schools throughout the South. Okay. Freedmen's Bureau was supposed to provide aid to the poor and to the elderly. So we're not just talking about, handing out cash. We are talking about providing support to those who were impoverished and to the elderly. And I want to add this. We are not just talking about freed people here. In this particular case, for not just for schools, but for this aid, it would also reach out to war refugees, which included those Southern whites who had been hurt by, devastated by the impact of the war. Okay, so providing aid to the poor and the elderly also meant helping Southern whites. The other thing that the Freedmen's Bureau was expected to do, and this is a doozy, was settle disputes between Southern whites and Southern blacks. These could be land disputes, these could be business disputes, whatever. But if there is a disagreement, political, economic, social, whatever, the Freedmen's Bureau's job is to serve as the middleman and to settle those disputes. The other thing, the last thing that the Freedmen's Bureau, the Freedmen Bureau is supposed to do was to secure equal treatment before the courts for freed people. And to make sure that if you were a freed person, or even if you were a white person who had been loyal to the Union, that if you were brought before the court for any kind of reason, that you would get fair treatment, that you would not be unjustly punished for any kind of reason. So all of that said, it's a lot. The Freedmen's Bureau has a lot to do, which leads me to obstacles, okay? First of all, Congress is basically shooting itself in the foot here because from the get-go, only 1,000 agents are assigned to the Freedmen's Bureau. It's actually fewer than 1,000 agents assigned to the entirety of the South. And when I say that, I want you in your mind's eye. You'll see a map a little later, but in your mind's eye, if you can imagine this, from Texas all the way to Virginia, down south to Florida, all of those states in between would only get 1,000 agents from the Freedmen's Bureau. You need 1,000 agents just in Texas. I mean, Texas alone is massive. There are thousands and thousands of people who live there. And all sorts of different communities, different issues. So of course you need I mean, 1,000 agents in Texas is a really low ball estimate, right? So you're putting the pressure on fewer than 1,000 agents to do all of the things that I just listed for you. Then on top of that, Congress initially says, okay, we're just going to throw this out there and give it 5 years. So you want a government agency made up of 1,000 people at the most, 1,000 people to do all of this stuff in 5 years? From 1865 to 1870, you want them to be able to help the poor, help the elderly, build schools, settle disputes. You want them to do all of that in 5 years? It's impossible. It is absolutely impossible. Okay? It's an overwhelming task. Now, that said, there are some key things that come as a result of the Freedmen's Bureau. And that is, first and foremost, and I don't know if I've listed it here. Yes, I have. The Freedmen's Bureau will build schools throughout the South. In fact, this is where you have the first public schools established in the United States. Prior to this, if someone were to be educated, it would be because of tutors or because you were sent to private schools. Public schools is the first sort of real significant success of this Reconstruction era. And I will add, it is to the benefit of both freed people and white people. And this is key because for the first time ever in their history, not only are freed people, Black Southerners, getting an access to education, but so are poor Southern whites. Poor Southern whites, a vast majority of whom were illiterate, a vast majority of whom had been taken advantage of because they were uneducated. Now their children had the opportunity to finally go to school and escape that poverty. So it was to the benefit of everyone. The other thing that happens is that the Freedmen's Bureau, in this aim to help the poor and the elderly, will establish hospitals, orphanages, and asylums. Asylums meaning places to help those who were deemed mentally ill, mentally challenged, those who had gone through psychological breakdowns. Now, do they have treatments that are as advanced as we have now? Not even close. So asylums could be really, really scary places and quite traumatizing. But before, people who were going through mentally challenging issues were left in the streets. Many of them were abandoned. Many of them became addicts and died penniless and in terrible, tragic ways. So the Freedmen's Bureau is a change to that. The Freedmen's Bureau will also present ideas on land reforms, and this is going to be very important for you to remember. So land reforms is directly addressing what freed people had been talking about in economic goals that they had for their economic freedom, right? What the Freedmen's Bureau is going to argue is that if you want to harmonize race relations in the South, you do have to look at people's economic status, because this is not just something that's affecting freed people. It's affecting the millions of poor Southern whites who had been, stuck in poverty because of slavery as well. And the way that you fix that is by creating a system that has fair wages, that has better working conditions, and that improves a worker's situation in life. So what the Freedmen's Bureau is saying is, listen, we accept that not everybody is going to have their own farm. Not everybody is going to be a landowner, and that's okay. But if somebody is going to work on somebody else's land, then that worker, that laborer should have access to fair wages. They should be working in good working conditions, which includes regular hours, and no such thing as, extended hours or dangerous conditions. And they should be able to live a comfortable life where they can provide for their family in a reasonable way, right? And not live in this continuing cycle of abject poverty. So when we talk about these land reforms and all of the things that the Freedmen's Bureau really sort of present and even accomplish, they are able to do this despite their biggest sort of criticism, right? A lot of people are worried that this was only targeting freed people, and it's not. Freed people and poor Southern whites and even some small landowners will benefit from the programs that the Freedmen's Bureau actually introduces into the South. Now, is it always successful? No. There are a lot of cases of people who aren't paying attention to what they need to do. There are cases of people who aren't actually doing their job as agents for the Freedmen's Bureau. There are Freedmen's Bureau agents who are overwhelmed by the task. So they try it and it's not as effective. So all of that is true, but the programs are designed to benefit both Black and white Southerners, but most especially those who are on the bottom half of the economic ladder. The problem, though, for the Freedmen's Bureau and for Republicans in general is the President of the United States, and that guy is Andrew Johnson. So just some background on Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was a Democrat who was from Tennessee, so a Southern Democrat at that. The reason why Abraham Lincoln picks him to be his vice president is because Lincoln thinks that by choosing a Southern Democrat, he will send a message to Southerners that he is appeasing to them, that he is willing to compromise, that he's reaching out to Southerners and saying, see, I like Southern Democrats. I'm willing to work with Southern Democrats. I'm choosing a Southern Democrat as my vice president. Please like me. Andrew Johnson is a guy who comes from a very poor family background, but manages to get an education. He becomes a teacher, and then he'll train as a lawyer, and then he gets into politics. He's not a very good student, by the way, so it's kind of miraculous that he becomes a lawyer and then gets into politics, but still, he works his way up. He knows how to hustle, so there is that. But other than that, he's not great. So after Lincoln is assassinated, keep in mind, moderate Republicans are meh about Andrew Johnson as vice president. Radical Republicans hate this guy. They hate Andrew Johnson. And they're furious with Lincoln for choosing him. They get mad at Lincoln all the time, and they are especially mad at Lincoln for choosing Andrew Johnson. So Lincoln is assassinated, and here comes this Andrew Johnson guy to take over, and it's the radical Republicans' worst nightmare, because this guy is not someone who is going to prioritize Reconstruction. He is certainly not going to prioritize helping freed people transition into American society, because one thing that Andrew Johnson is for sure is a racist. He is a really big racist. He's also an alcoholic, but that's a separate story. So Andrew Johnson, when he is presented with the Freedmen's Bureau bill, vetoes it immediately. He says that the Freedmen's Bureau is government overreach, that the federal government has no right to create this kind of agency, that it's none of the federal government's business to do this kind of work. And if freed people want to transition into mainstream America, then they're going to have to figure it out on their own. Andrew Johnson, who I should add is angry at plantation owners. He thinks that the war is the plantation owners' fault. Johnson seems to go out of his way to help plantation owners, because as the Freedmen's Bureau starts to do their work, because Congress overrides his veto. This will happen a lot, by the way. As the Freedmen's Bureau goes forward and establishes all of these programs and successfully creates these institutions, Johnson tries to find ways to undo what they've established. So, for example, Johnson will order, just some background here, freed people had gone to different federal lands in the South and established their homes there. And when I say federal lands in the South, what I mean is during the war, the U.S. Army would go to different plantations and declare that land federal land. They would take over the property and then say, okay, thanks for the land. This is ours now. And then as the war was coming to an end, freed people were allowed to come onto the land, and then they would actually establish their homes there. They started living there, they started working there, and Johnson issues an order that evicts all of those people. All of those people are ordered to leave. And then those plantations are then returned to their former owners. So now that wealth, because land is wealth, that wealth is given back to plantation owners, right? It's now returned. So the vast majority of freed people, especially those who lived in rural areas, the vast majority of freed people remained poor and without property. And they had no choice but to work on white-owned plantations. And so most of them actually went back to the plantations where they had worked prior to the war, because that's who they knew, that's the land they knew. And so why try something else? They couldn't afford to move, right? They couldn't afford to leave the state, so they went back to where they came from. Not only that, but by doing things like that, it also guaranteed that poor white Southerners were also forced to do the same thing, that they would have to go back to working for white plantation owners rather than gain access to their own land, because the only way they could get their own land is by having access to those federal lands. But Johnson says absolutely not. So now, rather than restructure the economics of the South so that this vast majority of the people who are living on the bottom half of the economic ladder would have a chance to come up and a chance to improve, he basically says, absolutely not. You are stuck in poverty. And the reason why he does that is because he did not believe that Black Americans should have that opportunity. He makes it very clear that this is too much of a helping hand. Even if it would be to the benefit of poor Southern whites, he said, no, that's too much. If it gives Black Americans the same opportunities, then no, nobody gets it. I would rather nobody got it than everybody getting it. What is introduced as a result is this system of sharecropping. And sharecropping is essentially when a person or a family rented a part of the plantation, and the crop that the family produced would be split between the family and the plantation owner. I am going to skip ahead for a second because I want to show you the system and how it works. So we'll start here at the top. This is step one here, right there. So the sharecroppers provided land and seeds. So essentially, you have to make this agreement with the landowner about what you're going to plant and how much land you get. Okay. Now, the sharecropper is responsible for buying food and supporting his own family, clothing, shelter. And when I say shelter, I mean rent. all of that is going to be from a store or from the possessions that the landowner has. So everything is going to be from the landowner. So whatever he buys to support his family, that's going to be profiting the landowner. But here's the thing, the sharecropper doesn't have that money immediately. He doesn't have that money in hand. So he's buying it, as this points out, he is buying it on credit. Okay, that's important. And those of you who know or understand credit, if you have credit cards, then you understand what this means. You don't have the money. What you're saying is I'm going to owe you for this. Keep in mind, he is already going to have to pay half of the crop that he is working to produce. And now he's going to owe, on top of that, he is going to owe for food and clothing. So then he'll do the work. He plants and harvests the crop. He gives the landowner the crop to sell. The sharecropper gets half of the earnings. And then whatever he's purchased over the course of that year, all of that goes up to back to the landowner, because that's what he owes the landowner. However, the landowner is also going to say things like, well, on all the things that you bought on credit, I'm charging you interest. And here's what else you owe me. You owe me for rent for living on my property. You owe me for damages to this, or you owe me because you had to use my tools in order to work the land. You owe me because you used seeds and I had to purchase those seeds, so you have to pay me back for the seeds that you purchased. All of those things are charged to the sharecropper. So in the end, the sharecropper ends up in greater debt, right? It's less and less of the share that this sharecropper gets to hold on to, right? Sharecropper, when we talk about the word share in this context, we mean a percentage. So initially, let me see if I can erase a lot of this. So initially, when we talk about what all of this means, this whole idea of, purchasing land or working the land seems ideal, right? It seems like a great idea. But the problem here is we are talking about an issue where he starts by promising the landowner half the crop, but as the year goes on, he is losing more and more of a percentage of that crop. He is losing more and more of the share that he was supposed to earn, right? And that was the problem here. So that's what I want you to keep in mind. Now, the other thing that I want you to pay attention to is the fact that when we consider this whole idea of sharecropping, right? Sharecropping is actually part of a system that is larger than larger than just freed people. Okay, it's actually going to affect poor white Southerners as well. The way it affects poor white Southerners is they too will have to work in this system of sharecropping, right? They can't afford to purchase their own land. And so they're stuck in this sharecropping system as well. You may have heard of, if not, this might be a new term for you. You may have heard of tenant farming. Tenant farming is the same system. It's the same process, except you might have access to a larger percentage of the crop, but it's the same idea. Both groups, both Black Southerners and white Southerners, are subject to this idea of the crop lien system. And the crop lien system is a part of sharecropping. It's when your crop that you produce is taken as collateral, where you are using the crop to pay off your debt, right? The crop lien system is basically when If you've ever heard of a bank taking a lien on your car or your home, essentially what it's saying is that somebody else owns your stuff. Somebody else has ownership on what should be your property. And the crop lien system basically establishes and solidifies this idea of a permanent cycle of poverty. These people cannot escape poverty. The only ticket out of this poverty is if their children are able to go to school, get out of school, some level of job training, and earn money that can get them out. That's literally the only way. Okay. It is incredibly problematic. What this allows for is opportunities, right? When Johnson pushes this idea of allowing plantation owners to take back their land and to reclaim all of this property, it almost gives this green light to allow for a sort of reestablishment of the rules and the laws of their Southern society prior to the war. But instead of calling it slavery and slave codes, Southern governments that had been quickly established in the first year or two after the war, they passed things called black codes. Black codes were laws passed by these Southern governments that attempted to regulate the lives of former slaves. They were passed by Southern governments in an attempt to regulate the lives of former slaves. On the right-hand side, you will see black codes that had been passed by the state of Texas in November of 1866. There are two sections to this. It's pretty straightforward. But in it, it details what freed people had the right to do and mostly what freed people could not do. So we're going to talk about what these black codes essentially delineated. So socially, it still allowed for legalized marriage. However, they wanted to, and they put this in writing, they wanted to make it explicitly clear that black people could only marry black people. You could not marry outside of your race. In fact, if you look and see, let me see if I can point this out here. On this primary source here, it talks about all of the things that they could do, shall have the right to make and enforce contracts, all of this stuff. And then later on, they'll make all of these rules of what they could not do. If there is any law that, any attempt to repeal laws that prohibit the marriage of white and black races, that will not be permitted. Okay. So Texas, of course, already had a law that prohibited interracial marriage. You could not, what they're saying in this black code is, you could not pass a law that prohibited or repealed, I should say, repealed that law. They wanted to keep it on the books. That's what was really important. So yes, you can have marriage, but no to interracial marriage. In terms of political rights, what's listed for most people is you have access to courts, but it's limited access to courts. By that, what I mean is you cannot, notice the X here, you cannot testify against white people. Make sure that you look at what's allowed and what's not allowed. So testifying against white people, absolutely not. You could not serve on a jury if you were black. You could not serve on a jury, and you also could not serve in the state militia. And that is down to, we don't want black people having access to weapons. That's the point, right? So no testifying against white people, no serving on juries, no serving in the state militias. That's how political rights, that's some of the ways that political rights were limited. But the biggest and most significant political right that is limited, the thing that they want to prevent in all scenarios, of course, is the right to vote, right? What we want to make sure, and you can see this is, so they list serve on juries, you could not hold office or vote at any election. And then they delineate state, county, municipal. Don't vote. You cannot vote at all at any time. That's the main point. You have no vote and no say in this democracy. Now, economically, it gets a little bit more complicated. You could have ownership of property, but the access to that property is a little bit more complicated because if the property you want is in contention with a white owner, the white owner is going to have access to that property, not you. Right? So it's really problematic. You have access to certain kinds of property. It has to be very specific. It's in specific areas. If a white person wants that property, then a white person is going to get that property. But here's the most important, especially in light of what we just talked about with sharecropping. If you could not afford to purchase your own property, which is a vast majority of Black Southerners, mind you, then you were required to sign a contract with a landowner. Okay? Your contract would last for a year, and the contract was created by the property owner. So the plantation owner would write the contract. They would determine the terms of the contract. So they're the ones determining the hours. They would determine the pay that you would get. And believe me when I tell you, this is not a whole lot of pay. They would even, in some cases, have determine under what situations or what circumstances they could extend your contract. And if you said, you know what, I don't want to work in these conditions, I am not going to sign a contract, you could be arrested and hired out to a plantation owner. So somebody else somewhere, the state government could just say, you know what, this is a guy who's available, you could hire him, and you would be forced to do work. Okay? So a lot of these Black Southerners would just go back to the plantation owners they knew because they knew them, and they understood the owner, they understood the land, and that's how they worked. Otherwise, they'd be forced to work for somebody else, and who wants to do that? This is essentially slavery without it being called slavery. Okay? When we talk about the response to this, radical Republicans are furious, right? Because what they're going to argue is, we just fought a war and you're going to do this in our face? Absolutely not. So what radical Republicans decide to do is they decided that they are going to push for more legal changes than even what Lincoln had in mind, right? So when Lincoln was in office, towards the last year of his term, the last year that he was in the presidency, he knew that slavery had to be abolished. And so he would push for not only a law abolishing slavery, but he said that it needed to be an amendment. It had to be written into the Constitution. And in December of 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified and it was written into the Constitution. Now, so it abolishes slavery except under the conditions of imprisonment. So if you are taken as a prisoner in the United States, your labor could be sold to companies, to other states, only to the benefit of the state. So if I were arrested and taken to prison, my labor could be used for for a private company, for another state, and the fruits of my labor, whatever would have been used to pay me, those wages would go to the state. So those are the new conditions of slavery. Okay? Now, radical Republicans are going to take it a step further, and they've listened very carefully to activists like Frederick Douglass, and they are going to push for an amendment on citizenship. And that is the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment will be ratified in 1868, but this is a lot. It is originally presented in 1866 as the Civil Rights Bill. It passes the House, it passes the Senate, and Andrew Johnson says, absolutely not. Johnson says that Black people should not be citizens. He does not believe that they have the right to be American citizens or to identify themselves as American citizens. Remember, in no way, in no context does he accept or believe in their equality, nor does he want to even consider any degree of equality. Okay? So that's going to be very important for you to remember. This is why Congress comes back with another civil rights bill, but in this case, it's to push towards an amendment. The 14th Amendment has an asterisk by it because we're going to talk about that in more detail in a minute. But one of the things that I want you to go ahead and give yourself space for is there are a couple of things that we're going to talk about. First and foremost is the 14th Amendment. In my opinion, you don't have to agree with this, but the 14th Amendment is the most important amendment in the entirety of the Constitution because not only does it tell you, it identifies you as a citizen, but not only does it tell you your rights as a citizen, it explains your responsibilities as a citizen. Okay? It identifies your rights, but it also explains your responsibilities. And it really, in doing so, helps to establish what the relationship is between you and your country, the obligations you should feel as a citizen. And for the sake of time, the only thing that I'm going to emphasize in the 14th Amendment for you is Section 1. 14th Amendment has 5 sections, but we're just going to talk about Section 1. First and foremost, Section 1 establishes birthright citizenship, meaning if you are born in the United States, then you are a citizen of the state that you were born in, and of course, the United States. So I was born in Colorado, which made me a citizen of the state of Colorado and then a citizen of the United States. If you were born in New Mexico, you would have been a citizen of New Mexico and consequentially a citizen of the United States. Birthright citizenship recognizes that by being born here, you are a part of the country, right? It roots you. That's why citizenship is so important. It establishes your identity, your national identity, and it gives you roots. The same way as I talked about at the beginning of this lecture, your family gives you roots, your family gives you a sense of identity. Having citizenship gives you a sense of identity, right? And birthright citizenship in the 14th Amendment, it gives you a rooted sense of identity, right? The second thing that it does is it guarantees, and this deserves underlines and asterisks, put it in all caps. It establishes the concept of equal protection under the law. Equal protection under the law. In other words, it's saying that the Constitution does not distinguish or differentiate between black or white, male, female, rich, poor. If you are a citizen of the United States, then you are the same as every other citizen. The law applies to you the same way that the law applies to Bill Gates. The law applies to Bill Gates the same way it applies to your brother, right? The law is the law. It is the same all around. Now, is that true in reality? Is that always enforced? No, because that's humanity, right? And so human beings are going to make the mistakes that we make, and systems are flawed and problematic. However, what I want to note here is the power of these words, because it is the first time in written history that these words are actually written into a constitution, that citizens are equally protected under the law, that the law is the final word, so that no matter who you are, from the president to the newborn just born in your state, all of these people are equally protected under the law, but they're also held to the same standard of the law. And that is miraculous. It is astonishing, especially considering that it is written and ratified in 1868. It is incredibly important that you remember and you acknowledge how powerful and forward thinking that is, especially considering that we're only 3 years out from ending a civil war, right? Radical Republicans will take it a step further. And in 1870, they will ratify the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment establishes the right to vote. Now, the right to vote applies to citizens, and at that time it was not for citizens who are 18 above. 18 above does not happen until the 1970s, right? So at this point, it's, I believe, somewhere that you have to be 30 years old, I think, or somewhere in your mid-20s, but the voting age was higher than what it is now, but as long as you were a citizen and you were a male, so if you were a man and you were a citizen, you had the right to vote in 1870. Now, the caveat here, the exception to the rule, is that the 14th Amendment did not apply to Native Americans. There's a whole separate thing going on there. And if you want to know more, you can take American Indians with me and I'll explain it to you. Or you could take History of Oklahoma with me and I'll explain it to you there. But it's a whole other thing. So the 14th Amendment does not apply to Native Americans, and the 15th Amendment obviously did not apply to women and, of course, Native Americans either. So this is specifically to male citizens, okay? Now, keep in mind, if you are a suffragist like Susan B. Anthony, you hate this amendment and you are very, very angry about it, okay? Now, that said, Radical Republicans see these amendments as huge, huge victories. But in the meantime, as they are pushing for all of these amendments, there's a guy in the White House who is doing the best that he can to stop them, right? So he's vetoing their bills left, right, and sideways. The way that Congress is able to pass these amendments and then push for their ratification is because they've essentially found a way to control Andrew Johnson. They've passed 2 bills. One is the Tenure of Office Act. The other is the Command of Army Act. So give yourself some space in your notes. We're going to talk about both. The Tenure of Office Act basically says that the president could not fire anyone who had been appointed by the Senate. Or not appointed by the Senate, but had been approved by the Senate. Here's what we mean. Anyone that the president nominates for his cabinet, so the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Health and Human Services, all of these are nominees. And they go through this process of meeting with senators, and then the Senate, there's a Senate committee who actually interviews him or her, and then they go through this interview process that's public and in front of a committee, and then it's presented to the entire Senate, and the Senate votes, and the Senate is who hires that person for that job. So while the president might nominate, the Senate is who hires them, okay? Now, this is particularly important because when Andrew Johnson becomes president, he keeps all of Abraham Lincoln's cabinet members. And one of those cabinet members is a guy named Edwin Stanton, Stanton, Stanton. Edwin Stanton is the Secretary of War. And Stanton is also a radical Republican. Okay. This is the thing. He is such a radical Republican that he and Lincoln argued all the time. They debated all the time. In fact, there are stories of Stanton just yelling at Lincoln and Lincoln making fun of him because that's the kind of guy Lincoln was. But Stanton is the radical Republican who's in the cabinet and recognizing and representing the radical agenda. And what Republicans are doing through the Tenure of Office Act is protecting Stanton's job, right? What they're doing is making sure that Johnson doesn't do anything to fire Stanton. And I'm going to explain why in a minute, but I just want to make sure you write that down. They're wanting to make sure that Stanton is not fired. So what they're saying is, you can't fire Stanton because we're the ones who hired him. So it's none of your business. Even though you are working directly with him and you don't like him, does not matter. We have to be the ones to fire him. The second law that they passed, or the second bill that they passed, is the Command of Army Act. The Command of Army Act says, even though the president is the commander-in-chief, all military decisions have to be approved by Congress first. Okay? So let's say, for example, that worst case scenario, I'm president of the United States. Okay? That's worst case scenario, guys. I want the Army, if I order the Army to the entire armed forces to go on vacation somewhere, what Congress is saying is, no, you can't do that, because even though you're commander in chief and you have technically the final say over any and every military decision, what we're doing is saying that we have the final say. We have to approve all of your final decisions. So you're not really the commander in chief. You're the commander in chief, but in words only, right? Every decision that you make has to be approved when it comes to the military. Here's why they're doing all of this. The radical Republicans in this time, in response to what the Southerners have been doing with black codes and that sort of thing, they have come up with this plan of military reconstruction. When we talk about military reconstruction, the idea is to divide the South into 5 military districts. Okay? Now, let me preface this by saying this plan is presented in 1867 through a series of Reconstruction Acts, as they call it. And in these Reconstruction Acts, essentially, they are splitting up the South in 5 zones, 5 military districts, as you see in this map. Okay, so Zone 1 is Virginia. That's District 1. District 2 is the Carolinas. District 3 is Georgia, Alabama, Florida. District 4 is Arkansas, Mississippi. And District 5 is Texas and Louisiana. Okay, now the reason why Tennessee is there is because Tennessee was a part of the Confederacy, but because Tennessee had done everything they needed to do to be admitted back into the Union, and they did it prior to the Reconstruction Act of 1867, they were already readmitted into the Union. So they had been readmitted into the Union in 1866. These other guys were struggling to get readmission. So in these military districts, what Congress does is they send a Union general to oversee each military district. So a Union general is in charge of District 5, another general is in charge of District 3, so on and so forth. Okay? So now, instead of Southern governments made up of, people that support plantation owners or represent the needs and values of plantation owners, those Southern governments are dissolved. And radical Republicans are like, nope, we're starting all over. Now you live in a district. We're going to put generals in charge there. And while we put generals in charge there, we are starting all over. You're going to write new constitutions. You're going to have all new elections. You're going to put new people in charge. Those people and those governments and those constitutions have to have our approval. And until you do that, you cannot be readmitted into the Union. So you can see on this map the years underneath each state. Those years indicate when these states were readmitted. So Texas and Mississippi, Virginia, and Georgia weren't readmitted until 1870. The other states were readmitted in 1868. So it is pretty radical, and for a lot of Southerners, quite a blow. It's very devastating. However, there is a shift in power that is worth talking about that I do want to acknowledge. And that is what happens after 1870 that is particularly interesting. So in this time period of military reconstruction, as we're working on new constitutions and that sort of thing, after the 15th Amendment is ratified and black men could not only vote, it also meant they could run for office. So what starts to happen is these black men decide that they don't want to just watch from the sidelines. They want to be active participants. So in the lithograph that you see on the left-hand side, these men are the members of the congressional delegation, the black congressional delegation. All of them except for one are congressmen. One of them is a senator. And this is the first congressional delegation of black representation in the history of the United States. There had been no black people, there had been no black men elected from the North, right? None of them had been able to vote. So when the 15th Amendment is ratified, what I want you to keep in mind is that there isn't this overwhelming population push from the North to elect black people. It comes from the South. So you'll notice that this is the black congressional delegation. And they are the ones who are elected to positions of leadership. On the right-hand side, what you see there are the black members of the Louisiana State Assembly. And in the center there is a man named O.J. Dunn. O.J. Dunn was the lieutenant governor of Louisiana. And O.J. Dunn was a former enslaved person. When we talk about the power, the impact of the Reconstruction Amendments, and why Reconstruction could have been so incredibly significant, from the very beginning, black men in particular saw this as an opportunity to contribute to their community and to contribute to their government. What they wanted to do immediately is to represent their people, represent their communities, and lead their state, because they saw it as their homes too, because it was, right? Louisiana was their home, and the United States was their home. Now, does this mean that everything is smooth sailing? Absolutely not. So there are two groups of white Americans that I'd like to mention here that are worth talking about. The first group is nicknamed carpetbaggers. So if you've ever watched Mary Poppins, you'll know that Mary Poppins travels with a bag that's made out of carpet. And it literally holds everything. So, of course, in the 19th century, that's an actual means of travel. That's actual luggage, where people would pack up everything they had in the carpet bag, and carpet bags were really sturdy, so they could hold a lot and not fall apart. So carpetbaggers were essentially people who were from the North. These were Northern whites who packed up whatever they could and moved to the South. The problem, though, with these people is that they weren't moving to the South because they were genuinely interested in rebuilding the South. They were interested in the South because they were opportunists. They saw this as a chance to create a name for themselves. They saw this as an opportunity to make money. They saw this as an opportunity to create a political career for themselves. So, in other words, they saw this as their chance to reach a new status, a higher economic level. That's what they're trying to do. It's not out of a love for Southern society or an appreciation for Southern culture. And Black leaders in particular, and the Black community in the South in particular, have a big problem with carpetbaggers because they recognize these people as opportunists. They recognize them as greedy, and they also see them as people who are essentially taking away opportunities from people who truly understand Southern culture and Southern identity. The other group are scalawags. Scalawags is a true insult if you were a white Southerner, because scalawags were white Southerners who were always loyal to the Union or who politically identified as Republicans. Because the reason why they are insulted in the worst possible way is because they were seen as traitors, right? They betrayed their own kind, they betrayed their own culture, they betrayed their state, and they betrayed the South. And so by being loyal to the Union, by supporting the Republican Party, they were betraying their own people. And what happens in the end is those white Southerners who were loyal to the Union ended up getting positions of power thanks to military Reconstruction. So they're a little bit opportunist too, but, not in the same way as carpetbaggers. Okay. Now, that said, let's talk about how Reconstruction falls apart. There are a couple of things that happen here. Reconstruction falls apart primarily because there are people who either stand in its way or they stop caring. So we're going to talk about both of those groups here. First of all, Northern industrialists. By this, I mean these are people who in the North are industry owners. They have access to the most wealth and therefore the most power in the North. And most of these people are living in New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut. They have political power as well as financial power. And what they don't like about Reconstruction is the fact that Reconstruction is looking to change or challenge the structure of the country, right? It's seeking to create opportunities for the bottom half of the economic ladder. And in doing so, it challenges the existing power structure. And that's a problem for them. So Northern industrialists are going to campaign against Reconstruction policies. They are going to work really hard to try to stop Reconstruction bills. What they're going to do also is they're going to start putting money in the South. They're going to start investing in Southern economics, but specifically in those people who are going to support this old style of living and old style of Southern culture. That's what they want. And then, of course, is the establishment of the Ku Klux Klan. The KKK is established in 1866, so just a year after the war is over. The Klan is the first terrorist organization recognized in the United States. And they are literally a terrorist organization. These are people who are not just using their words to intimidate people. They are physically attacking and terrorizing people, not just Black people, but also those people that we refer to as scalawags, these white Republicans in the South, but mostly Black Southerners, and especially after 1870, when Black Southerners were daring to vote, were daring to run for office, were daring to establish their own businesses, members of the KKK would harass, attack, and in many cases kill these people for trying to live in some semblance of freedom, and what the Klan would describe as an attempt to see themselves as equal. The Klan, it was trying to essentially make sure that everybody understood what their place was, right? So what the Klan argues is that their purpose was to reestablish the the identity of the South, the identity of the Confederacy. It's important that you write that down and make note of that, because the Klan is going to come back later on with an entirely new purpose. So initially, the Klan is there to establish or to reestablish the identity of the Confederacy and Southern culture. Now, the other group that's really problematic will be liberal Republicans. They're also mainstream Republicans. Eventually, these Republicans are going to get tired of the Reconstruction agenda. They're going to be tired of this idea that Republicans only prioritize, or that radical Republicans only prioritize Reconstruction issues. Liberal Republicans are going to focus more and more on other issues, especially the economy, because by 1873, there's going to be an economic panic that's going to cause a depression. So thousands upon thousands of people are going to lose their jobs. The economy is going to stall. And so because of that, this group of Republicans no longer care about Reconstruction. And when a party is split on an issue, you are essentially losing all momentum on that issue, right? You're losing any kind of real support you have on that topic. So that leads me to this biggest problem, and that's the fact that Northerners stopped caring about Reconstruction, stopped caring about the South in general. Northerners have a lot going on here. So in the 1860s, 1870s, and we'll get into this more in the next couple of lectures, but over the previous 2 decades, more and more Americans were moving out west. And because they were moving out west, they were starting to settle on lands that had already been occupied by Plains Indians tribes. And the further west they went, the more land they were trying to take from native tribes. And the problem with that is that violence was breaking out. And as time went on into the 1860s, but most especially in the 1870s, the violence was becoming worse. It was becoming bigger. So more Northerners are paying attention to what's happening out west, especially because railroads are going out there. And as railroads are going out there, Plains Indians tribes are responding in greater violent acts. Then on top of that, you have the economy, and the economy is really problematic. You have millions of people who are now out of work. How do you deal with that? And Northerners are prioritizing the economy, of course. So with all of that going on, they are not going to care about Reconstruction. They are not going to prioritize what's happening in the South. Is the Klan behaving themselves? They don't care. And because all of these groups of people have thrown their support in different ways, are causing a distraction, are creating disruptions, are easily swayed by other issues, you have in the South the rise of a group called the Redeemers. The South, during the late 1860s into the 1870s, starts to see a new elite economic class. So prior to the Civil War and just after the Civil War, it was the plantation owners. Now it's landowners, merchants, lawyers, and entrepreneurs. Landowners, merchants, lawyers, and entrepreneurs. These are the 4 groups of people that make up the new Southern elite. And they call themselves the Redeemers because they believe that it is their job, their responsibility to redeem or bring back the old Southern way of life, the Southern cultural identity, the Southern economy, the Southern structure of society. And what they start to do is they create this environment in which they reestablish themselves as political leaders in the South. So they put themselves in position where they are reelected to political office. These redeemers will become state legislators. They will be in Congress. They will be elected to governors. And we'll talk about in more detail, we'll talk about how this happens, how this systematically happens. By systematically, I mean through the legal system. Legally, they are able to do this by denying other people their rights. These redeemers are able to gain access to power, and they use it by doing the same thing that plantation owners did. They successfully used the argument of race, that while we are not economically in the same situation, at least we have our racial superiority. That's how they regain power. So with all of this happening, Republicans are really struggling to hold on to power. And that brings us to the election of 1876. 1876 is a presidential election year, and Republicans are desperate to hold on to the White House. Their candidate is a guy named Rutherford B. Hayes, Hayes, if you're curious. And the Democrats have a guy from New York named Samuel Tilden, Tilden. Hayes is from Ohio. Ohio is a big Republican area, but it's also been a hotbed of political activity. But when we talk about how this election turns out, Tilden wins the popular vote and he leads in the Electoral College, but he doesn't win enough votes in the Electoral College. And the thing is, common sense would say to you, well, if he's leading in the Electoral College, then there should be a stronger, greater push by the Democrats to insist that Samuel Tilden take the White House. Instead, what happens is the Republicans and the Democrats, there's a long process to this because the election takes place in November. December goes by and January goes by and no decision is made. February comes and there's a compromise. And the compromise is this. Republicans will start backing off of Reconstruction issues, including removing any kind of existing control they have over Southern governments. So any support they gave to the Southern governments that they helped create, including areas where they made sure that Black voters and Black leaders had the kind of funding they needed, the kind of extra support they needed, all of that was withdrawn. All of that is gone now. All of that support is gone now. That protection is gone now. And all of that is in exchange for Rutherford B. Hayes to be in the White House. And let me tell you something. I'm a historian and I can't tell you of one single thing that Rutherford B. Hayes accomplishes while he's in office. But what I can tell you is that as a result of this compromise, every single government that is created in light of 1870 and all of this Black leadership that's sent to Congress and established in state legislatures, they're gone. They don't have the kind of support they need. Black voters, Black men aren't allowed to vote anymore. They are restricted from voting. We'll talk about how later on. And that's how Reconstruction collapses. Now, on top of that, to make things worse, there is a concerted effort over the next several decades from that point up until the 1990s to create this story of the Civil War and create the story of Reconstruction that presents the South as victims. The Southerners were victims of what is called Northern aggression, that the Northerners were bullies. They'll tell the story of how enslaved people actually enjoyed being slaves, that they were treated really well. They were treated as members of the family. It's an insane narrative that is created to help protect this sort of story of, the glories of Southern culture, but even the glories of Northern culture and Northern identity. But the consequences of that is that you miss the real narrative and you don't see how ugly and terrible things were, but you also miss the great potential, right? There are these moments of light. For example, when we talked about the 14th Amendment, when we talked about the Louisiana state legislature, all of these opportunities where you see, oh my gosh, there are real changes that could happen here and real significant strides being made here. All of that is stripped away and you miss that because the entire historical narrative has been changed because nobody wants to talk about what really happens. And on that note, I want to talk about this political cartoon on this page, and we'll end it there. This political cartoon is by Thomas Nast, who at the time was the most famous cartoonist, and in fact, even present day, he is one of the most historically notified, recognized cartoonists in American history. In it, you'll notice that he is identifying two characters here. One is a member of the Klan, right? That's this person here. And another is a member of what's known as the White League. The White League is a notoriously racist organization based out of the North. I think it started out of New York, but I'm not entirely sure about that. But at the top of the page, you'll notice the title of the cartoon. And the title of the cartoon is The Union as It Was, right? And the Union as It Was is especially important because it's written over an eagle. And the phrase inside the eagle is, if you can see it, is this is a white man's government. Okay? You'll notice that these guys are shaking hands here as if they are unified in their efforts. And their unification, of course, comes at the cost of this black family pictured here, right? This black family is cowered in terror as they are holding this baby who seems to be lifeless in his mother's arms. And they are cowering in fear while a black man is hanging dead from a tree and a schoolhouse is on fire here in this background. And what I want to point out here is that what Thomas Nast is arguing is that these two groups and groups like them have worked together to reestablish a country in which you have second-class people, right? You have established a group that are terrorized, right? And he describes it using this phrase. He says it's worse than slavery. And here's why. His argument here is that in this agreement, that in this process, these are people who are legally recognized as citizens, and yet they are not treated as citizens. They are not reaping the benefits of citizenship. They are not allowed the access to those equal rights as citizens, right? And in the meantime, they are killed, they are harassed, they are kept in a cycle of poverty, and they don't have the things that they should have because of their race. And Nast is making this argument that we have just gone back to what it was before. So those 12 years, which could have been so much better, instead ends up in a tragedy. we will pick up from there when we talk about the Gilded Age.